How well do we know the people we grew up with in the same neighborhood? How much can we trust our partners, with whom we live in the same house for many, many years? Today's story begins in the small town of Walton, in the state of New York, USA. It is a town surrounded by mountains, forests and lakes, with a population of about 5,000 residents, so all the neighbors know each other well. At least, that's what they thought before the events we're about to recount happened. On February the 19th, 2013, the police chief, along with his deputy, was searching for 48-year-old Debra Sundstrom, who was a cashier at the only supermarket in the small town. A few days earlier, Debra had stolen a customer's wallet and had been arrested. A court date was set for the theft, and she was released on the condition that she would appear in court on the day of her trial. However, she did not show up in court, so the police were looking for her to arrest her again. First, they went to her house, but found it locked. Debra wasn't there. Next, they went to her parents' house. Debra's parents told the police that their daughter was likely at the cabin of Nick Bosco, the man she was involved with. With no other option, the police headed there. It was winter, and it had snowed. As they approached, they noticed that there were no car tracks or human footprints in the snow around the house. Nevertheless, the police chief and his deputy knocked on the door. They heard a dog barking loudly from inside the cabin. Within seconds, the door opened, and there stood the woman they were looking for, Debra Sundstrom. The police chief said to her, "Debra, you didn't show up in a court as agreed, so we are forced to arrest you." She was wearing her pajamas. She told the police officers she was caught off guard and asked for some time to change and get dressed. Regulations stipulate that in such cases, officers should not leave the person they are about to arrest alone. If the person who is about to be arrested needs to get dressed, this should be done in the presence of the officers. However, this case was different. The police chief had known Debra for over 25 years, so he and his deputy remained at the threshold of the cabin, and Debra went inside alone to get dressed. About 15 minutes passed, and Debra still had come out. Suddenly, the officers heard 2 loud gunshots from inside the cabin. They tried to get inside, but the door was locked. It took them a few minutes to break it down. Once inside, the officers split up. The police chief went upstairs while his deputy stayed on the first floor. As he climbed the stairs, the police chief saw Debra's dog in a pool of blood, and a little further away, Debra herself, lying on the floor. Both she and the dog were dead. Blood was flowing from the woman's head, and next to the bodies of the dog and Debra was a hunting rifle. At first glance, it seemed like Debra had shot the dog and then turned the gun on herself. However, he didn't have so much time to investigate the scene further, because he heard his deputy shouting from the first floor that a fire had broken out in the cabin. They ran and quickly got out. Inside the cabin remained the bodies of Debra and her dog. The cabin was engulfed in flames. This was very upsetting for the officers. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. Normally, this case would have been very simple and straightforward. They would have arrested Debra for not appearing in court for the case against her for stealing the wallet. Then the trial would have taken place, and since the offence was not very serious, she would probably have received a minor penalty. But now she was dead. She had taken her own life and killed her dog as well. She had also set the cabin on fire. How and why could a minor offence, for which she would hardly have been punished, drive her to do such great harm to herself? So let's get to know the main character of our story better. Debra Sundstrom was born and raised and essentially spent her entire life in the town of Walton. Everyone who knew her described her as friendly and kind. After graduating from school, Debra attended nursing classes. She then found a job that perfectly matched her kind nature, working as a nurse at a care centre for people with disabilities. In 1992, when Debra was 27 years old, she met and married Randy Sundstrom, the man of her life. At that time, Randy had just retired from the military and had moved to Walton. He was a hard-working and a very capable man. He could fix anything that broke in their home. Even the neighbors would ask Randy for help repairing their electrical appliances and minor damages in their homes, and he never refused. Although he wasn't a native of Walton, his kindness and repair skills made him beloved by everyone. Soon the residents of the small town considered Randy one of their own. From the beginning of their acquaintance, Debra and Randy were inseparable. In all their photos, they are seen hugging and smiling. They were so devoted to each other that they decided to spend all their free time together, doing things they enjoyed. One of these activities, their true passion, was gardening. They spent many hours in their garden, growing various vegetables. They were so successful that they sold or gave away part of the produce to their friends. In the state, there was an annual competition for growing the largest pumpkin. The couple was so good at gardening that this challenge couldn't leave them indifferent. They began participating in exhibitions and competitions for the largest pumpkin. Over time, Randy became president of the local Gardeners' Society. In 2007, Debra and Randy participated in a gardening documentary titled The Pumpkin Lords. The following year, in 2008, the couple achieved what they had been striving for. They set a state record with a pumpkin weighing 660 kilos. This undoubtedly brought even more recognition to the town of Walton and to Debra and Randy. They were so united and had so many shared activities that everyone saw them as one. And so we come to 2010, where they had already been married for 18 years, when suddenly something happened that shocked Debra and everyone who knew them. In February 2010, Debra was crying, called a friend and told her that Randy had left her. As it turned out, according to Debra, Randy had been cheating on her with a woman from another town for the last 6 months. Recently, this woman had become pregnant by Randy. For this reason, he decided to leave Debra and his 18-year marriage and go to his mistress and the future mother of his child. And so it happened. Randy packed his things and left Walton, leaving Debra alone. This news spread quickly throughout the town. They liked him very much and considered him one of their own. No one expected him to treat his wife this way, especially after so many years of marriage. However, as it turned out, few knew who Randy really was. This wasn't the first time he had left a woman with whom he had a long-term relationship. Before Debra, 18 years earlier, he had a long-term relationship with another woman. In 1991, this woman became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl. Randy left her alone with a newborn child and moved then to Walton, where he later married Debra. Debra knew about this but hadn't told anyone until then. When she realized that her husband had left her for another woman, she revealed his past, and everyone thought that this story had repeated itself. Only this time it was Debra in the position of the abandoned wife. Furthermore, she began to tell friends and relatives other details that no one had known until then. Their life with Randy wasn't ideal as it seemed to those around them. Debra began to confess that Randy was very controlling and aggressive. By today's standards, we would characterize his behavior as abusive. She said that sometimes after a fight, he even hit her. Friends and acquaintances had noticed bruises on her body, but when she was still married to Randy, Debra said the bruises were from falls or hitting on furniture. During her marriage, she didn't tell anyone the truth about the beatings. Now, however, that Randy had left and moved away from the town, she had nothing left to hide. Of course, everyone felt sorry for her, but her problems didn't stop there. In 2010, the rehabilitation center where she worked closed and she lost her job. Now, in addition to her emotional troubles, she also had financial problems. For a while, she lived off the proceeds from selling vegetables from her garden until she finally found a job as a cashier at the local supermarket. Her financial problems were resolved, and Debra's life began to improve. It had been 2 years since Randy left her, and she seemed to have fully recovered from the breakup. Then, in 2012, Nick Bosco appeared in Walton. He was a 50-year-old man who loved nature. He enjoyed hunting, fishing, and mushroom picking, and generally all activities related to nature. Nick had a 2-store cabin in the Walton Forest. For the past 10-15 years, he had been going to Walton for vacations to relax in the tranquility of his cabin. Now, at 50, he decided to settle there permanently and moved to Walton. Apart from his cabin, Nick Bosco had something else that connected him to Walton: his cousin, with whom he was very close. Nick's cousin and his wife knew Debra Sundstrom well. They thought, why not introduce Nick to Debra? Both are currently single. Maybe something good will come out of this introduction. So they organized a dinner and invited Nick and Debra to meet. Nick loved cooking and took charge of preparing the food. Debra and Nick hit it off immediately after the introduction and became a couple. Soon after, they started living together, sometimes at Debra's house and sometimes at Nick's cabin. Debra seemed very happy. She had a new relationship with a wonderful man, and her job provided her with a decent salary. She had left her past behind, and so we arrive at February 2013, when the couple had been together for about a year. On the evening of February the 3rd, 2013, Nick, Debra, Nick's cousin, and his wife gathered again for dinner. That night, Nick confided privately to his cousin that he planned to propose to Debra soon. Debra was very upset that evening. This was likely due to her being fired from her job at the supermarket. She explained that the problem was that she was training a trainee. The trainee was rude to a customer. The customer complained to the store manager, and the manager fired both the trainee and Debra. However, there was an issue. This was the story Debra told her loved ones. The real cause was entirely different. On January 23rd, 2013, Debra's day started as usual. She was at the cashier station, serving customers at the supermarket. A customer, at least according to his account, left his wallet on the counter where Debra was working. He went outside, but quickly realized he didn't have his wallet with him. He returned to the counter and asked Debra to give him his wallet. Debra replied that she hadn't seen it and had no idea where it was. They started arguing intensely. Eventually, the customer, unable to find his wallet, went to the police. The officers came to the store, but Debra told them she had no idea what wallet they were talking about and that she hadn't taken it. The store manager took her side. He said he knew his cashier well, and until then, Debra had always returned all items customers left behind. The truth could only be revealed in one way. by examining the footage recorded by the security camera above the counter. There, it was clearly seen that the customer indeed took out his wallet to pay and left it on the counter. He then left, forgetting it there. Debra took the wallet and put it in a drawer under the counter. The store manager couldn't believe what he was seeing. To him, Debra was an exemplary employee. He never expected her to steal something from someone. Yet, this seemed to have happened. The cashier hid the wallet in the drawer and then claimed she hadn't seen it. The officers told Debra she had to follow them to the station. At this point, her behavior shocked those who had known her for so long even more. She vehemently refused to go to the police car, so much that the officers almost had to forcibly put her into the vehicle. At the station, she was charged with theft. Of course, there was undeniable evidence of the theft she had committed, thanks to the store's security camera recording. It was futile to her to continue claiming otherwise, and in the end, she admitted to taking the wallet. The Walton police chief had known Debra for over 25 years. They did not arrest her. They released her on the condition that she would appear in court on the scheduled trial date. However, as we already know, Debra did not appear in court. This led to the starting point of today's story. On February the 19th, 2013, the officers set out to find Debra. The investigation ended, as we mentioned before, at Nick's cabin, with Debra shooting and killing her dog, and then turning the gun on herself after setting the cabin on fire. Firefighters arrived quickly at the cabin, but took time to control the blaze. The cabin was almost completely burned down, leaving only part of the basement and the brick fireplace. Even after the fire was extinguished, the officers had to wait quite a while until the area cooled down enough for them to enter and start searching for Debra's body. Eventually, the next morning, they found what was left of Debra's body. The autopsy was conducted the same day, and as expected, the cause of death was a gunshot to the head. But one question plagued everyone. Why did Debra do this? Such an intense and destructive act could have been caused by the impending punishment for stealing a wallet. Not to mention that since the wallet was found and returned to its owner, her sentence would have been very light, for a simple reprimand to a most small fine. Obviously, something else was hidden beneath the surface they saw. Trying to find the answer, the officers continued to investigate the burned cabin, and unfortunately, they soon discovered something truly horrifying: the remains of another person. Apparently, when the officers went to arrest Debra, someone else was in the cabin. They thought maybe this person shot Debra and the dog, then set the fire, but ultimately didn't manage to escape and also burned to death. The body was in very poor condition. To identify it, they would have to analyze the only things left on him: his bones and teeth. According to the results of the dental records analysis, it was found that the second body found in the cabin belonged to Nick Bosco, the man who was planning to marry Debra. Could it be that Nick Bosco was the one who pulled the trigger? This was a possibility, but again, a new question arose. Why and how did Nick Bosco himself die? As we already know, 2 gunshots were heard in the cabin, one that killed the dog and one that killed Debra. The detailed forensic examination provided the answer to this question. As it was determined, there was a bullet wound at the back of Nick's head. Additionally, there was a gash in the bone of his neck. That is, he likely died from a bullet wound to the head, which then exited through his neck. Or rather, to put it better, he was murdered. In fact, he was murdered many days before the cabin burned down. So when the officers went to arrest Debra for the theft she committed, she had been in the cabin for several days already, and with her was the body of her murdered fiancé. Of course, this again changed the scenario the officers were thinking about what happened. Perhaps it was Debra who killed Nick, hid in his cabin for a few days, and when the officers came to arrest her, she set the cabin on fire and then shot the dog and herself. The last people who had seen Nick alive, other than Debra, were his cousin and his wife on February the 3rd, when they all had dinner together, while the fire broke out on February the 19th. Additionally, on February the 5th, Debra had called Nick's brother and told him that Nick's phone was broken, so from now on, to contact them, they could only call her phone. This further reinforced the officer's belief that Debra had killed Nick, and probably on February the 5th. The officers tried to find more evidence to understand what really happened and decided to go and search Debra's house. Indeed, there they discovered something interesting. On the stairs leading to the basement of the house, there were red paint stains in various random spots. This seemed strange to them because the paint was spread without any specific pattern. It was red paint stains scattered here and there. They thought it might be covering something. Ultraviolet light showed that indeed the paint was covering traces of human blood. This further mobilized the investigations in the house and its surroundings. The police dogs were drawn to a blue plastic barrel in the garage. When they opened it, the officers were even more shocked. Inside the barrel were human remains which belonged to Randy Sundstrom, Debra's husband, who was supposedly left her 3 years ago. The remains were placed inside a tarp and the body's wrists were tied with rope. It was evident, even without the official examination, that the body had been in the barrel for a very long time. So obviously, 3 years ago, Randy Sundstrom did not leave Debra and move in with his pregnant mistress, as his wife had told everyone, and everyone believed. He had been murdered by his wife and placed in that barrel. For the last 3 years, Debra herself and anyone else who entered her garden had seen this barrel, a barrel containing human remains. You must be wondering how this is possible. In 2010, when Randy disappeared, his parents were already deceased. The only relative he had was his sister, but they had no contact. So when he disappeared, no one thought to look for him or file a missing person report with the police. Friends and neighbors believed Debra's story, that Randy had left her for another woman and moved away. No one could imagine what had really happened. No one thought that Debra could have killed him. As for the cause of all Debra's behavior, we can only speculate. Perhaps Randy did hit Debra, as she told her friends. Maybe some disagreement between them escalated and somehow led to his murder. 3 years had passed and the exact cause of his death could not be determined, but the forensic report clearly states that it was a homicide. Now, regarding the murder of her second partner, Nick Bosco, again we can only guess what happened. As we know, Debra lied to Nick about the reason for her dismissal from the store. Nick could have found out the reason, that Debra had stolen a wallet, and this could have led to a fight and then escalated to his murder. Or Nick might have found Randy's remains in the barrel in Debra's garage. Nick had been going to her house for a year and slept there half the time. If he did discover the barrel, then maybe Debra killed him to keep him from turning her into the authorities. Another theory is that Nick might indeed have proposed to Debra, as he had told his cousin, but she couldn't marry him since she hadn't divorced Randy, whom she had killed 3 years earlier. Nick might have pressured her to get a divorce from Randy. Something that could have led to his being searched for and the truth being revealed. That he had not moved to another town, but had been murdered. So she might have killed Nick to stop the possible search for Randy. Perhaps, having escaped the law for 3 years, she became emboldened and thought she would kill anyone who stood in her way without consequences. There are many theories, but one thing is certain. In the small town, everyone was shocked by the actions of Debra Sundstrom, whom they thought they knew very well for years and whom they liked very much. Finally, we would like to note one more interesting detail. As we said, her first husband, Randy, had no relatives with whom he maintained contact. But we mentioned that in 1991, Randy had abandoned a woman with a newborn baby girl, his daughter. For the rest of his life, he had no contact with her. The girl, now an adult, didn't even know what her father looked like. The police, of course, found her and informed her of his death. And fate had it that she was the one who organized Randy's funeral, the father she never knew. Of all the versions you've heard, which one do you think is true? Do you think the real cause of Debra's behavior is something else? Is it possible for someone to hide their true character from their partners, relatives, friends, and the world for almost their entire life? Dear friends, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. This will help our development and give us the opportunity to create more videos.